There are things you see in the woods that you can never unsee, and there are secrets you carry that slowly eat away at you like frost consuming a dying tree. I'm 55 years old now, and for 23 years I've walked through my life carrying a weight so heavy that some mornings I wonder how my legs still hold me up. My name is John, and I need to tell you about the winter of 2001, about what I tracked through the Montana wilderness for 6 days straight, and about what I found at the end of that trail. Because if I don't tell someone soon, I think this secret might just bury me alive. I was a forest ranger back then, 32 years old, and convinced I knew these mountains better than I knew my own heartbeat. The Bitterroot Range had been my home since childhood. My father worked these same forests, and his father before him. We were men built for solitude, comfortable with the silence that settles between the pines like snow on a windless night. I lived in a small ranger station about 40 miles from the nearest town, a place called Timber Creek that barely qualified as a dot on the map. 300 people on a good day, less during the winters when the cold drove the weak-hearted down to the valleys. That December came in hard and mean. The kind of cold that makes your breath crystallize before it leaves your lungs, that turns your skin tight and makes every movement feel like you're wading through molasses. I'd seen plenty of harsh winters, but 2001 felt different from the first snowfall. The animals knew it too. The deer moved in larger herds than usual, the birds fled south early, and the wolves stayed closer to the valley floors. Something was wrong with the mountain, though I couldn't name it yet. The first body turned up on December 7th. Tommy Marsh, a logger who'd been working a cut about 15 miles northeast of my station. They found him 3 days after he'd gone missing, or what was left of him. I was part of the search party, and I still remember the moment we came across him in that clearing. The snow around his body was stained dark, and the way he was torn apart, it wasn't like any animal attack I'd ever seen. Bears hibernate that time of year, and mountain lions are surgical in their kills. This was something else. Something that had fed with a violence that seemed almost desperate, almost human in its fury. Sheriff Dalton tried to keep it quiet, but word spread fast in a town that small. By the time Christmas came around, 2 more people had vanished, a couple from Missoula who'd been staying in a cabin up near Clearwater Pass. The Forest Service brought in experts, wildlife biologists who examined the tracks and the evidence. They talked about a rogue grizzly, maybe one that had failed to enter hibernation properly, driven mad by hunger. But I saw those tracks myself, and I knew they were lying to themselves. Whatever made those prints was walking on 2 legs as much as 4. The old-timers in Timber Creek had a different explanation, one they only whispered about in the back of Murphy's bar after enough whiskey had loosened their tongues. They talked about the Wendigo, that ancient thing from the old stories, the creature of endless hunger that stalked the deepest winters. Most people dismissed it as superstition, the kind of folklore that frontier towns cling to like a security blanket. But my grandfather had told me stories when I was young, stories about things he'd seen in his 30 years as a ranger, things he could never explain. I'd always filed those tales away as the ramblings of an old man, but standing in that clearing with Tommy Marsh's frozen blood staining the snow, I started to wonder. I decided to track it on December 28th. The snow had stopped falling for the first time in weeks, and the sky opened up into that crystalline blue that only comes in deep winter. I loaded my pack with supplies for a week. Food, ammunition, my father's old .30-06 rifle, flares, rope, and enough cold weather gear to survive if I got stranded. I told the station I was doing a routine perimeter check, but that was a lie. I was going hunting. The track started about 2 miles north of where they'd found the couple from Missoula. They were fresh, maybe 6 hours old, pressed deep into snow that had frozen overnight into a crust. The stride was wrong, too long for a bear, too wide for a deer, and the pattern shifted between 2-legged and 4-legged in a way that made my skin crawl. I followed them into the high country, up through the pine forests that grew so thick the snow beneath them was shallow and dry. For 3 days, I tracked those prints deeper into the wilderness. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero at night, and during the day the sun barely crested the peaks. I was moving through a landscape that felt prehistoric, untouched by anything human. The silence was absolute. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals, nothing but the crunch of my boots and the whisper of wind through frozen branches. Whatever I was following, it had cleared out every living thing for miles. On the 4th day I found the first real evidence. A deer carcass, maybe 2 days old, hidden beneath a rock overhang. But here's what stopped me cold. It had been partially butchered. Not torn apart like the human victims, but carefully, almost surgically separated. The hide was folded, the organs removed and buried in the snow. Someone or something had taken only what it needed and preserved the rest. That's when I first started to question what I was really tracking. The trail led me to a canyon I'd never seen before, a narrow slash in a mountainside that didn't appear on any map I'd studied. The walls rose up 200 feet on either side, dark stone slicked with ice that caught the thin sunlight like obsidian. The tracks led straight into it, and I remember standing at that entrance, my hand on my rifle, knowing that if I went in there, something fundamental was going to change. I could feel it the way you feel a storm coming, that pressure in the air that means lightning. I went in anyway. God help me, I went in. The canyon swallowed me whole. That's how it felt, walking between those massive stone walls with barely enough room for 3 men to stand shoulder to shoulder. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in there, and ice hung from the rocks like teeth in some enormous mouth. My breath came out in clouds so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead, and every sound echoed until I couldn't tell if the footsteps I heard were my own or something else moving parallel to me in the shadows. I followed those tracks for maybe 2 miles into the canyon, and with every step that feeling of wrongness grew stronger. The prints were changing, becoming more erratic, and I started finding things along the path. Strips of cloth, a leather glove, what looked like part of a backpack torn into pieces. But there was also other debris that made no sense. Carefully stacked rocks forming small cairns, pine branches arranged in geometric patterns, and once, a circle of stones with a small pile of bones in the center that looked almost ceremonial. On the 5th day, exhausted and running low on food, I heard it for the first time. A sound that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal. Somewhere between a moan and a growl, echoing off the canyon walls so I couldn't tell which direction it came from. I'd never felt fear like that before, the kind that locks your joints and makes your vision narrow to a pinpoint. I raised my rifle, scanning the shadows, my finger on the trigger, ready to shoot at anything that moved. But nothing came. The sound faded, and the silence rushed back in even heavier than before. I realized then that whatever this thing was, it was smart. It was aware of me, had probably been aware of me since I entered its territory, and it was making a choice about whether I lived or died. I made camp that night in a small alcove, too terrified to sleep but too exhausted to keep moving. I kept my fire small, rationing my wood, and sat with my back against stone that was so cold it burned through my jacket. Sometime around midnight, I heard movement outside my shelter, the crunch of snow, the scrape of something against rock. I grabbed my rifle and a flare, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly hold them. That's when I saw it for the first time. Just a silhouette at the edge of my firelight, maybe 30 feet away. Tall, maybe 8 feet when it stood fully upright, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent at angles that hurt to look at. Antlers rose from its head like a crown of bone, and its eyes caught my firelight and threw it back at me in a gleam that was almost golden. But here's what I'll never forget. It didn't attack. It stood there, watching me, and in that moment I felt something I hadn't expected. Not hunger, not malice, but something closer to evaluation. We stared at each other for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then it turned and disappeared into the darkness so quickly and quietly that I almost convinced myself I'd hallucinated it. But the tracks in the snow the next morning told me the truth. I should have turned back. Any sane man would have. But I'd come too far, and more than that, something about that encounter had changed the equation. The Wendigo hadn't killed me when it easily could have. It had looked at me, and in those golden eyes, I'd seen something that resembled intelligence, maybe even curiosity. I had to know what it was doing up here, what it was protecting in this frozen hell. The canyon opened up on the 6th day into a hidden valley that took my breath away. A bowl carved into the mountain, sheltered on all sides by stone walls that created a microclimate just warm enough that the snow was shallower. Ancient pines grew here, trees that must have been 500 years old, and in the center of the valley, fed by a hot spring that sent steam curling into the frozen air, was a small pond that had never frozen. The tracks led to a cave on the far side of the valley, a dark opening in the rock face that was partially hidden by a fallen pine. I approached slowly, my rifle ready, every sense screaming at me to run. The entrance was decorated, there's no other word for it, with bones arranged in patterns, with stones stacked in deliberate columns, with strips of cloth tied to branches that fluttered in the breeze like prayer flags. I heard the sound before I saw anything. A soft crying, so human and so heartbreaking that it stopped me in my tracks. Not the Wendigo's growl, but something else. Something that made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't name. I stepped into that cave, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and what I found there shattered everything I thought I knew. There, in a nest made of pine boughs and cloth and animal hides, wrapped in careful layers like something precious, was a child. A little girl, maybe 3 years old, with dark hair and eyes that were too large for her thin face. She was alive, relatively clean, and wearing clothes that had been patched and mended with something that looked like sinew. And standing over her, moving between me and the child with a protective stance that was unmistakable, was the Wendigo. It didn't attack. It positioned itself as a barrier, its body language screaming a message I understood immediately. Not one more step. The pieces fell together in my mind like ice breaking apart. The careful butchering of the deer. The partially eaten human victims who had probably wandered too close to this valley. The supplies it had taken. Cloth, leather, anything that could keep a child warm. This creature, this monster from the old stories, was protecting her. It was keeping her alive. I lowered my rifle slowly, my hands up, trying to show I meant no harm. The Wendigo watched me with those golden eyes, and I swear to God, I saw something like hope flicker across its face. The little girl whimpered, and the creature immediately turned to her, making soft chittering sounds that were almost soothing, almost like a lullaby. That's when I noticed her hands. Small, pale, but the fingers were slightly too long, the nails darkened to something like claws. And her eyes, when she looked at me fully, had that same golden gleam in their depths. She wasn't fully human. Not anymore. Or maybe she never had been. I spent 3 days in that valley, and they were the strangest 3 days of my life. The Wendigo, and I still don't know what else to call it, gradually accepted my presence once it understood I wasn't a threat to the child. I watched them together, this impossible pairing, and I saw something that medical science and wildlife biology would never be able to explain. I saw care. I saw protection. I saw something that looked a hell of a lot like love. The girl's name was Anna, or that's what the Wendigo seemed to call her in its strange chittering language. She was scared of me at first, clinging to the creature's leg, but children adapt quickly, and by the second day, she was curious. She showed me rocks she'd collected, arranged in patterns I couldn't understand. She sang songs in a language that was part English and part something else, something older. And when she laughed, which happened more than I expected, the sound echoed through that valley like bells. I pieced together what I could from observing them. The Wendigo had found her, or maybe she'd been born to it, I couldn't be sure, and against every instinct of its nature, against the hunger that defined its existence in the old stories, it had chosen to protect rather than consume. It hunted for her, brought her food, kept her warm, taught her to survive in this brutal landscape. And she was changing, slowly becoming something that was neither fully human nor fully creature, something new that existed in the space between. The Wendigo communicated with me in limited ways. Gestures, mostly, and sounds that I learned to interpret. It showed me the remains of other humans who'd come too close, and I understood. It was protecting her from discovery, from people who would try to take her away or hurt her or study her like some kind of specimen. Every violent death I'd investigated, every torn body I'd found, had been a parent's desperate act of defense. On the third night, as we sat around the fire I'd built near the cave entrance. Yes, the Wendigo tolerated fire now for Anna's comfort. I tried to understand what I was supposed to do with this knowledge. I could report it. Bring in the authorities, scientists, maybe the military. They'd capture or kill the Wendigo, and Anna would be taken to a laboratory or a hospital where they'd try to cure her of whatever she was becoming. She'd lose the only parent she'd ever known, and that creature out there in the darkness would lose the only thing that had ever pulled it back from the edge of its own hunger. Or I could walk away. Leave them here in this hidden valley, keep their secret, and carry this weight for the rest of my life. I looked at Anna, sleeping peacefully with her head resting against the Wendigo's massive arm, both of them breathing in unison, and I made my choice. I thought about my grandfather's stories about the old ways, about how sometimes the world is stranger and more complicated than our simple categories of monster and human allow for. I thought about compassion and what it really means to protect something, and whether any of us has the right to destroy a bond we don't fully understand just because it frightens us. I left the valley on the 4th day. The Wendigo watched me go, and I like to think I saw gratitude in those golden eyes, though maybe I was just seeing what I needed to see. Before I left, Anna ran up to me and pressed something into my hand, a small stone carved with symbols I didn't recognize. I still carry it in my pocket every day, worn smooth by 23 years of worry. I reported back that the tracks had led to a dead end, that whatever had been killing people had likely moved on or died in the harsh winter. The attacks stopped after that. The Wendigo learned to hunt further away, to be more careful. Timber Creek went back to normal, and I went back to my life, or at least the shape of it. But I've lived these past 2 decades with the weight of that secret pressing down on me. I've wondered countless times if I made the right choice. I've dreamed about Anna, about what she might have become, about whether she's still alive out there in those mountains. Sometimes, on my regular patrols through the high country, I find small signs, a cairn of stones that wasn't there before, a pattern of sticks arranged just so, and I know they're still out there, still surviving, still protecting each other. I'm telling this story now because I'm dying. Cancer, the doctors say, spreading through me like the cold through those winter mountains. And before I go, I need someone to know the truth. That monsters aren't always what we think they are, that humanity isn't limited to human form, and that sometimes the most profound love exists in the places we're too afraid to look. If you ever find yourself in the Bitterroot Range, up near a canyon that doesn't appear on any map, and you see tracks that shift between 2 legs and 4, I want you to do something for me. Turn around. Walk away. Let them have their peace. Because what they've built together in that frozen wilderness, that bond between a creature of legend and a child who's becoming something new, is more sacred than anything you'll find in all our churches and temples. I tracked a Wendigo for 6 days in the winter of 2001, and what it was protecting changed everything I thought I knew about the nature of evil, the capacity for redemption, and the lengths that love will go to shelter the vulnerable. That little girl with golden eyes taught me that family isn't always about blood, and that monster is just a word we use for things we don't yet understand. I've carried this secret for 23 years, and now I'm passing it to you. What you do with it is your choice. But if you have any compassion in your heart, any understanding that the world is wider and stranger than our fear allows us to admit, you'll do what I did. You'll keep their secret. You'll let them live. Because some things are worth protecting, even if, especially if, we can never fully understand them.